One Communications presents The Scholar's Chair at Focus, a book written by American philosopher John Rawls. The book's title is Justice as Fairness, a Restatement. To help us explore the writings of this famous philosopher, our guest is the president of the Minaret of Freedom Institute, author and educator, Dr. Imad-ad-Dean Ahmad. John Rawls lists five fundamental ideas that are related to justice as fairness. One, fair system of cooperation, the idea of well-ordered society, the idea of a basic structure of such a society, the idea of the original position, and finally, the idea of citizens as free and equal. Dr. Imad-ad-Dean, are Rawls' ideas relevant to a just society?
I think they are epistemologically necessary for his conception of a just society. In other words, while one can conceive of a just society without using these ideas, um, it's hard to imagine how one would go about negotiating a just society without these principles.
A just society, you must start off with an idea that the society has a fair system of cooperation. In other words, people are working to be fair into society.
Is that the concept of fairness is easier to understand than the concept of justice. Justice can be a very complicated idea. In other words, it sounds simple, that everybody gets just exactly what is right. Yeah. But how do you decide that?
Yes.
Whereas the idea of fairness is much easier to understand. Children can tell you when something's not fair. Hey, that's not fair, they'll say.
So the idea that they are related is another discussion, but Rawls goes on to write that we might say that the fair terms of cooperation are fixed. And this is interesting. They are fixed by natural law, viewed either as God's law or given by prior and independent moral order publicly known by rational intuition. He's not excluding it, is he? I mean, at first when I was reading it, that he was trying to exclude it altogether, but he's not. He's just not regarding it as being the only way to get to a fair and just society. Would you concur with that notion? If not, it's okay. What are your views?
He's just saying that he's just admitting that there are alternative theories of justice, yeah. And he's classifying them. So he says that there's three kinds. One is that, although the first two he actually puts as kind of similar to one another, even though many people might disagree. But one is that there's a divine determination of that which is just. Mm-hmm. The other is that there is that it's something that can be rationally intuitive. Although these two can be the same. I mean, that's the whole point of the Mu'tazila. The divine law decreed by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is also the law that if your reasoning were only good enough, you could figure out by rational intuition.
Yes, yes.
He's saying that as opposed to those two theories that may or may not be different from one another, he's got a third theory, which is to negotiate a concept of justice.
Right. Mm-hmm. And so he's not ruling out by deductive argument. That was the point of that section, that you don't have to rule out the notion of fairness using deductive reasoning.
No, I in fact, I thought the reason he even mentions deductive reasoning is only as a qualification on what constitutes rational intuition or divine revelation. In other words, if you rationally in terms of justice, that can be demonstrated by deductive logic as being wrong, then you would have to abandon it. Similarly, you know, for some religions, not all, a religion that a divine revelation that is can be ruled out by as contrary to logic can't really be divine.
John Rawls has written that the public political culture is not unambiguous. It contains a variety of possible organizing ideas that might be used instead various ideas of liberty and equality and other ideas of society. All we need claim is the idea of society as a fair system of cooperation is deeply embedded in that culture, and so it is not unreasonable to examine its merits as a central organizing idea.
So I don't think he feels it's necessary to talk about his negotiated system contradicting deductive logic, because his premise that negotiation is being done by reasonable people, and
Right.
therefore they're not going to agree to something.
I'm trying to figure out whether this idea is relevant in our current circumstances. Right now, we have people marching in the street because of notions of racial injustice. So I'm not quite sure that historical conditions are a kind of a foundation that you can build upon logically.
Well, I take this as a statement that of the conditions under which he's going to discuss the negotiations.
Yeah.
That you know he's dealing with people. His primary audience
Yeah.
is people who have lived in those circumstances, and so he's going to not pretend that they're going to be affected by their history, but rather he's going to say, well, this is the constraint that their history is going to provide. It also touches on another point that I know you wanted to ask about, and that is about are these conditions necessary for the negotiation to lead to his conclusions? And I think you would agree that they are, in the following sense. I don't think that, let's say, people who were raised in a non-pluralistic, non-democratic society would arrive at the same conclusions that Rawls does. For example, Saudi Arabia.
Right.
Even if they were to try to follow his method, I think they would end up in a different place.
Yeah. You would have to have free and equal people, and that's not the case in that with a kingdom. That's not the case.
Rawls wrote, among his historical conditions is the fact of reasonable pluralism, which rules out comprehensive doctrines as a basis for a workable political agreement on a conception of justice. Since justice as fairness looks for such a basis, it follows a different course. Rawls continues, we are in need of a workable political conception of justice among various ideas of liberty, equality, and society. Rawls' writings suggest that humans have at least the capacity for genuine toleration and mutual respect. This capacity gives hope that the diversity of worldviews in a democratic society may represent not merely pluralism, but reasonable pluralism.
Is reasonable pluralism a workable political agreement for the concept of justice, Dr. Imad-ad-Dean?
Yeah, I think it is. First off, to just be sure we understand what he's saying when he says it can't be rooted, it can't be a comprehensive doctrine. He's just limiting what he wants to get out of this negotiation. He's saying we're not going to agree on everything. So, you know, when we're done with the negotiations, Christians will still be Christians, and Muslims will still be Muslims, and Jews will still be Jews. What he wants to find is what is the areas of agreement that we can come out of these things. And he's saying that that is possible. If you got reasonable people, they can negotiate a concept of justice that will allow for a workable political agreement. and I emphasize here the words workable. It's not going to be ideal justice.
Rawls wrote, "We cannot tell in advance whether the idea of social cooperation and its two companion ideas will provide the organizing ideas we need for a workable political conception of justice. The public political culture is not unambiguous. It contains a variety of possible organizing ideas that might be used instead, various ideas of liberty and equality, and other ideas of society. All we need claim is that the idea of society as a fair system of cooperation is deeply embedded in the culture, and so it is not unreasonable to examine its merit as a central organizing idea."
It leads me to my next question. Is openness to a variety of ideas meaningful to the attainment of a workable political concept of justice? Is this variety necessary? And if not, why not make it homogeneous?
Well, again, I think the problem here is that Rawls is asking for a negotiated answer to the question. And if people are homogeneous, these issues that they're going to have that you're going to have to struggle with in order to come up with a workable theory are not going to be considered.
The possibility of reasonable pluralism softens but does not solve the problem of legitimacy. How a particular set of basic laws can legitimately be imposed on a diverse citizenry. For even in a society of reasonable pluralism, it would be unreasonable to expect someone to endorse, say, a reasonable Catholicism as the basis for a constitutional settlement. Reasonable Muslims or atheists cannot be expected to endorse Catholicism as setting the basic terms for social life. Nor, of course, can Catholics be expected to accept Islam or atheism as the fundamental basis of law. No comprehensive doctrine can be accepted by all reasonable citizens, and so no comprehensive doctrine can serve as the basis for the legitimate use of coercive power.
The idea of public justification. How do you get through that, Dr. Imad-ad-Dean? The idea of public justification. He said he introduces it. He said this is his sixth idea. So we have five already discussed. This is sixth idea and the final idea. He said the idea of public justification and the three other related to it, those of reflective equilibrium and overlapping consensus and free public reason. I know that this is very, very part and parcel to the Islamic tradition, the Abrahamic traditions. This reconciling and thinking about the variety of opinions and differences is critical because we live in a society like that. And and finding overlapping consensus. I mean, Sharia is a part of the Islamic way of getting to consensus, and then of course a free public reason to be able to discuss these ideas openly and publicly. It's critical, I would think.
If you're asking about justifies the accommodation of pluralism in your conception of a just society, certainly that is something we find in the Islamic teachings, but because the Islamic teachings came to a pluralistic society. You had, you had Jews and you had Christians as well as the non-believers. And when the Prophet, peace be upon him, had the message revealed to him, and therefore it's not surprising that these questions are dealt with and justified in Islam.
Mm-hmm.
The point the point would be this, and actually maybe I can tie them together. There's a verse in the Quran where it says that after the Muslims are supposed to invite the others to, to Islam, that if they refuse, that they're supposed to say, well, at least abide by your own beliefs, in terms of those things that would accommodate a pluralistic society. So that Rawls is calling for the same thing here, that he's saying there is a way by which people who do not share comprehensive systems can come to an agreement on what he calls the overlapping consensus.
Yes. Yes.
They don't agree on everything, but there's certain things they should agree on.
Yes.
And that can be the basis for a just society.
Yes. Or at least, as he says in writings further on, narrow the disagreements, instead of having these extremes. I think this is so relevant and important in our political discourse today. It's almost like he is speaking to us now. It's just so needed. I don't see this kind of sensitivity in the political discourse today.
Rawls places his hopes for social stability on an overlapping consensus. In an overlapping consensus, citizens all endorse a core set of laws for different reasons. In Kantian terms, each citizen supports a political conception of justice for reasons eternal to her own comprehensive doctrine. Recall that the content of political conception is freestanding. It is specified within reference to any comprehensive doctrine. This allows a political conception to be a model that can fit into any number of worldviews that citizens might have. In an overlapping consensus, each reasonable citizen affirms this common model from within her own perspective. Here is an example. The quotation that follows from the Second Vatican Council of the Catholic Church shows how a particular comprehensive doctrine, Catholicism, affirms one component of a liberal political conception, a familiar individual liberty, from within its own perspective. This Vatican Council declares that the human person has a right to religious freedom. This freedom means that all men are to be immune from coercion on the part of individuals or on social groups, and of any human power, in such wise that in matters religious no one is forced to act in a manner contrary to his own beliefs, nor is anyone to be restrained from acting in accordance with his own beliefs, whether privately or publicly, whether alone or in association with others, within due limits. The Council further declares that the right to religious freedom has its foundation in the very dignity of human person, as this dignity is known through the revealed Word of God and by reason itself. The right of the person, the human person, to religious freedom is to be recognized in the constitutional law whereby society is governed, and thus it is to become a civil right. Catholic doctrine here supports the liberal right of religious freedom for reasons eternal to Catholicism. A reasonable Islamic doctrine and a reasonable atheist doctrine might also affirm the same right of religious freedom, not, of course, for the same reasons as Catholic doctrine, but for its own reasons. In an overlapping consensus, all reasonable comprehension doctrines will support the right to religious freedom, each for its own reasons. Indeed, in an overlapping consensus, all reasonable comprehensive doctrines will support the right to religious freedom, each for its own reasons. Indeed, in an overlapping consensus, all reasonable comprehensive doctrines will endorse all of a political conception of justice, each for its own point of view.
I mean, that's what we're trying to get to. Reasonable pluralism has this variety of notions of what justice is, and you have to talk about it because that's what this democracy is doing. Does reasonable pluralism publicly justify our democracy? Fair system of, and he describes this notion of fair system of social cooperation. Does reasonable pluralism make a contribution to that? He makes it a big deal throughout his writing.
Well, it definitely makes a contribution to that.
Yeah, yeah.
Sure. But again, I want to reemphasize, he's arguing about this epistemic problem, about how you're going to negotiate. It doesn't guarantee the solution will be just. Yeah. And again, in the case of the United States, slavery was an example.
Yeah.
It didn't succeed there.
Yes. But there's also a whole host of injustices, that maybe even transcends slavery. How one handles commerce and the economy is at the top of that, I would think.
But Rawls has that very much in mind, because remember, he's not trying to justify the existing system. He's trying to come up with a way to talk about it so that you can even criticize the existing system by using his theory and say, well, I'm not saying the system is terrible, but I'm going to argue that it could be better because we have failed to address this problem in a fair way, and therefore it's an unjust system.
Well, I concur. The Rawls continues to write here in his writings, the idea of public justification goes to the idea of a well-ordered society. For such a society is effectively regulated by a publicly recognized conception of justice. That's interesting because we're trying to get to justice. People are not necessarily know what justice is or what is just and fair, but he says that the public justification goes to the heart of establishing this well-ordered society. I think he's actually stating that some sort of natural condition of the human being to understand what justice is.
He says very clearly that while he doubts, I think he doubts that we can rationally understand what justice is. Mm-hmm. I believe that. I believe he doubts it. But he believes we can rationally understand what fairness is, and that therefore we could negotiate a, pardon the pun, fairly just system,
right,
by talking about what do we think is fair.
Rawls continues he says that there are three political concepts of justice, Dr. Imad-ad-Dean. Why it is, of course, he writes, a moral conception, it is worked out for a specific subject, namely the basic structure of a democratic society.
I don't think morality per se is his interest here. It's going to be obviously part and parcel of the negotiating process. People are going to bring their moral sensitivities to it. But I think if you pressed him on the point of morality, he would say, well, that's part of a comprehensive system, and I don't want to get into that. People can disagree about what they think is moral, and let them, as long as they can agree with this overlapping consensus. Now, obviously, morality will influence that, but I don't think it's at the center of this discussion at all. I think it's one of the alternative ways of coming up with what is just.
Mm-hmm. And what do you think his way of coming up with a system of justice or justice as fairness is then? What system do you think he's using?
What you mean? What does he conclude?
Yeah. Well, we want to get there. Yes.
No, I mean, well, again, his methodology, I think, is that basically that if we will just all pretend we don't know who we are,
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
then we could agree to a pretty good system of justice. Because because we don't know who we are, it would have to be fair by definition. Now, as to what he comes up with, he ends up with a system in which he justifies basically a concept of what he's looking for is a fair end state.
Mm-hmm.
That the distribution is fair.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Not necessarily identically equal, because there may be other considerations, but more or less an egalitarian society.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And in that, I think he's mistaken. I'm much more partial to the views of Robert Nozick,
Yes.
who, in his critique of Rawls, said that it's a system. What you want is a system of fair process.
Right. Right.
And that's what people would negotiate for.
Mm-hmm.
Now, as was pointed out by your other guest, surveys indicate that actually people want both. Mm-hmm. They want a process they want to see a system in which the process is fair, and in which the end result, not necessarily egalitarian, but certainly with a safety net, so that the really, really vulnerable members of society are given some kind of protection.
Right, right. And I think that
because if we don't know whether we're going to be in that group,
right, that's right,
then we can easily say, despite the fact, like a severely handicapped person, yes, he had the same opportunity as everybody else in a political sense, yes. But that handicap made sure that it wasn't fair, and therefore something has to be done.
Yeah, absolutely. The Rawls continues to write that the public political culture of the democratic society, for example, the idea of society as a fair system of cooperation and the idea of citizens as free and equal, there we have it. These are ideas. That there are such ideas in their public culture is taken as a fact about democratic societies. Yeah, that would help. I think it would help to have members, the citizens, to think that the democratic system is fair and it treats everyone equally. Yes, I think that would further the cause of a fair and just society. What are your thoughts?
Well, the question that you that you put to me was, who determines the qualifications that citizens are free and equal?
Yeah.
And I think the answer to that is that the burden of proof lies on those who would exclude any given group. I don't think that the struggle for liberty ever ends.
Yeah.
It's not. Paradise is the end state. In this life, we've got to constantly struggle to maintain our rights, because even those which were conceded can be taken away. Mm-hmm. Obviously, anyone who's paying attention to current events can see that.
Yeah.
And so it's not just a matter of improving a system.
Yeah.
It's also a question of even just holding on to the good things that are in it that might be taken away.
He makes a great point of freedom of thought and association and the liberty of conscience. Clearly, this is a free-thinking society that he's putting together, and respect for the rule of law. That can help us get to a place of a just and fair society, or justice as fairness. Yeah?
The problem is that we don't have a way of actually imposing a real veil of ignorance on people.
Right. Right.
It's up, you can ask people, pretend you don't know,
Yeah.
but how do you get them to actually do that? I think it requires a certain degree of integrity and discipline